This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, Alex C., C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., and Samantha G. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and this week we're going to take a return to what we would think of as Greece, Asia Minor, territories around ancient Greece, and we are going to talk about a goddess from Thessaly called Enodia. Now, some people will say, well, Enodia is an epithet of Hecate. They'll say, oh, well, she's, Hecate, Enodia, sometimes she's referred to in that way. There have been writers that have said it said that the rites of Enodia were so similar that when they would talk about Hecate's temple at Aegina, they would say, oh, well, these are the rites of Enodia. Sometimes those names tend to be used interchangeably. As we're going to see, the name Enodia sometimes is also used interchangeably with Artemis and Persephone as well, which gives you some kind of a suggestion about what her nature might be about. But what I want to do is talk about Enodia and about what I think about the prevalence of her worship. And of course, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Thessaly, just a touch, because where she's from, she seems to be a deity very strongly identified with that area. So there is definitely a sense of her being connected to national identity in some way. And of course, Thessaly was actually a very important city, certainly in the archaic Greek region. So we want to look at the prominence of Enodia and of the things that are connected to her. She has a number of epithets, and she also has a number of connections with gods as well as goddesses that I think are worth exploring. So really the object of this podcast is to get down to, who is Enodia? I mean, we don't really have a whole lot of information about her independent of talking about these other figures. But yet it's very clear that she was an extremely important figure, at least from the archaeological evidence that we have. So what I want to do is start by talking about her. I want to talk about what her role is, where we find evidence of Enodia and Enodia worship or devotion, and what figures like Enodia and all of the other deities that she seems to be associated with, what does that actually say about her? What does that say, especially the groupings that she belongs to? And also just what this says about society at the time that her worship seemed to be much more prevalent. Yeah, so let's start with who Enodia is. So I'm going to start just by reading, standard Wikipedia, because I have done some research in other places, looking for articles and things. Most of what I find on Enodia, it's not really any much different from what I'm seeing here. And most of the other articles that I'm seeing have more to do with Enodia as basically with the archaeological evidence and trying to identify statuary and so forth, whether it's Enodia or whether it's Hecate or whether it's another figure. So there's no need to kind of get into that kind of granularity. But we do know that her cult seemed to be spread through Thessaly in particular, but Macedonia and parts of Thrace, which is where at least one theory places Dionysus worship as originating from. You will often see her sharing sanctuaries in a lot of places with Zeus. It will be Zeus Thalios and Enodia. And Interestingly, in the 4th century, it says she was part of a local dodekatheon, which is a cult of the 12. We think about the 12 Olympians, but this was more of a local one. I mean, we think about, she's not, obviously, neither Enodia nor Hecate is listed among the 12. I mean, Artemis is. But Persephone, the others, they're not deities of the cult of the 12, which is a solar cult, really. It's a cult that has to do with the 12 gods who live on Mount Olympus. And in this local dodekatheon, the goddesses were listed as Hestia, Demeter, Enodia, Aphrodite, Athena, and Themis. So this is a rather interesting grouping. So let's talk about what her name means first, and then we'll get into all of these other connections. The name itself means the one in the streets or the one on the road. And that could possibly mean a whole lot of things, but it's not hard to see the identification with Hecate when we talk about her as with Hecate as goddess of a crossroads, right? We have Hecate's suppers that are often left in these places, and crossroads are very important because they are considered to be thresholds between realms, really. The threshold is that place, that liminal place, perhaps between this world and the other world. And certainly if we're dealing with deities who are called upon to serve certain functions with regard to these crossings or thresholds, then obviously there seems to be some kind of importance of gaining the favor of these deities for protection. And it seems to be dealing with protection against some kind of crossing of some kind of boundary. Okay, so let's move on to what her associations are. It says Enodia is a goddess of roads, protection, which means she's apotropaic, ghosts, purification, the city, and cemeteries. And again, as I mentioned, the local dodekatheon. Okay, so let's think about that. Roads, as we mentioned with Hecate, protection, ghosts, purification. Okay, so she's associated with ghosts. That's another association with Hecate that we see as being the one who lights the way through the underworld. Purification. So there seems to be this idea here of being in a particular state for approaching the sacred, because obviously purification is a ritual that we undertake when we are doing something special or sacred, at least in a spiritual or religious sense. Her association with the city is interesting, and I am going to come back to that. And of course, cemeteries, which are also liminal places in and of themselves. Cemeteries are places where the dead are buried, whether it's their actual bodies or whether it's cremated remains. But either way, the tombs of ancestors were something that needed to be kept. You had to continually visit the grave and make offerings, and there were festivals to remember the dead. And oftentimes Enodia and Zeus Thalios were paired up in this particular context. And also, there's also there's statuary of Enodia that has been found, and they usually were found at entranceways to houses, which is very similar to what the Hecatea are. They're these these statues of the deity, and oftentimes in the base of them they have a little key. Either it's carved in there, or maybe there's actually one that's actually embedded in, maybe they have a little slot and they have a little key in there. And oftentimes there's some kind of an inscription that says something to the effect of, in the case of Enodia, please protect my child. And there's a number of these that have been found, and they seem to be connected to households and the doorways. They seem to be a very domestic kind of a thing, which is why I think it's interesting that she is put in a group in Thessaly with Hestia, who is the goddess of the hearth, Demeter, who is the goddess of agriculture, but also we see Demeter in terms of her motherly role with Persephone, right? She's this agricultural deity who's very similar perhaps to Rhea, and is, it has this idea of being this mother who provides in some way, provides the grain, provides the crops. And then we also have her with Aphrodite, who is a goddess of love, okay? So right now we are seeing all of these things that are associated with love, relationship, home, family. All these things seem to be connected here. Now Athena Now, you may have think of Athena as a warrior goddess, but Athena is also a goddess who's connected with weaving and also with certain domestic crafts. So Athena does have this domestic connection, even though she is a virgin goddess herself. And Themis is interesting because she is a titaness connected to order, to the idea of order and civilization. So this is almost a kind of pantheon, at least the female side of it, is connected to the domestic sphere and the order of the domestic sphere, the promotion of love, and the promotion of fertility, I suppose, to some degree, and also just the keeping of the hearth. Enodia is in this grouping, which suggests that she has a very important place in the home. And if she is there to be a korotropos, which means a protector of children, she would certainly be in this kind of grouping of deities that surround the family in some way and protect the family. Okay, let's go further on this explanation here. The name Enodia suggests she watched over entrances and that she stood on the main road into a city, keeping an eye on those who entered, and in the road in front of private homes, protecting the inhabitants that dwelled within. Divinities with this apotropaic function were expected to keep away dangers such as burglars, malicious spirits, and even pestilence such as mice. Other notable divinities with this function are Hecate, Hermes, and Apollo. And it says her main cult location, especially before the 5th century, was in the city of Pherae. Pherae was an important city of ancient Thessaly due to the location of the settlement. Now, it's worth noting, I was going to mention Thessaly a little bit here. Ancient Thessaly was a pretty prominent city or region in ancient Greece. Now it says, I'm just going to read a little bit from the history of it. It was home to extensive Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures from 6000 BCE to 2500 BCE. Mycenaean settlements were discovered in Thessaly, which we can associate with Agamemnon if we want to think mythologically. At the castron of Pelea Hill, in Volos, tablets bearing Mycenaean Greek inscriptions written in Linear B. In mythology, Thessaly was homeland of the heroes Achilles and Jason, as well as mythological creatures and peoples, centaurs, lapiths, Phlegians, and Myrmidians. Ancient tribes in Thessaly mentioned by Homer or other poets were the Aeolians, Magnetes, Perrhaebi, and the Pelasgians. So Thessaly is pretty important. I mean, you've got two major heroes of the ancient realm, Jason of the Argonautica, even though I consider his heroic status to be a little questionable, and Achilles, of course, who is the great hero of the Iliad, which, of course, is all about the wrath of Achilles. It's literally in the opening line, sing muse of the wrath of Achilles. So, yeah, very important place. Not some backwater. Thessaly was definitely considered to be a very important place. And it has been said that Enodia is very much tied up in Thessalian identity, that she was an important deity for them. She was like, if you want to say, their Hecate. But we also see her having some other connections as well. I'm going to read this from this is a Tumblr page, but there's some information here that's clearly been taken from some other sources, but it's a nice little summary. And I'll read this. Enodia is a Thessalian goddess whose name literally translates as in the road. It's likely she watched over entrances and was represented on the main roads in front of houses. Now, Johnston, and I am going to read to you a little bit from Sarah Iles Johnston too, describes a statue dedicated to Enodia that contained an iron key. The inscription asks for her help with a child. Johnston believes it was a domestic piece in front of a private home. Also, too, Enodia was called Alexitis, an epithet carried by Hecate, meaning the averter. Okay, now that's kind of important. Who protects from danger. She is also called Enodia Pherea. We know, too, Enodia has sanctuaries in Argos, Epidaurus, Sicyon, Corinth, Athens, Issa, and in western Macedon. In Thessaly, at least, torch races were likely hosted in her honor. These traits are all associated with Hecate in her role as goddess of roads, entrances, and of keys. So you see the reason why Enodia is often considered to be another version of Hecate. The association between the two dates back to at least the 5th century BCE. By the 4th century, Hecate Enodia is closely tied with ghosts in the treatise called On Sacred Disease. Fascinatingly, Enodia as an adjective is also used to describe wasps, which are, for some modern practitioners, related to Hecate. And there is, in fact, a butterfly species as well called Enodia. That said, it's questionable if Enodia bore these Hecatean traits originally, or if they came about because of her conflation with the goddess of the three ways. Was the small statue described by Johnston inscribed with a prayer regarding a child due to some innate bond between Enodia and children? Or was it done because Hecate Enodia was already known as a protector of children? Now, it's worth noting that these protective figures, certainly if they're there to protect the domestic sphere, there is going to be a special role in connection with children. And certainly Artemis, who Enodia has also been connected to, and Hecate have connections to children. Even though we may not think of that as their primary function, certainly Sarah Iles Johnston has suggested that this could have been part of their original function, particularly with regard to Hecate, because she may have been a goddess connected to childbirth, and that function may have later been taken over by Artemis. By the way, there's some people who have asked me questions about the connection between Artemis and Hecate, because I often refer to Hecate as the underworld Artemis, and somebody asked me to explain that once. And I found this little interesting piece. This is an article on sun myths and resurrection myths, and this is a little bit about Enodia here. So let me just, I'm going to read to you a little bit from this particular article, which is from, I'll give you the citation. I don't want to lose my spot here, but I'll go back and give you the citation at the end. It says, they are influenced also in their Greek form by the drama of other year deities connected to time in the year, such as Eurydice and Alcestis, whom this particular author is making the argument that they are underworld deities of their own, even though they're usually actually humans who have gone to the underworld. But she's looking at this kind of the theme of their stories. They have points of contact with Persephone, just as the Balkan goddess of the moon, Artemis the queen, Hecate, and Brimo are sometimes one with the dread goddess of Hades, meaning Persephone. In the Phoeniciae, Euripides, who understands such things well, calls Hecate the royal child of Leto. Okay, now, Artemis and Apollo were the twins who were born of Leto. So to call Hecate daughter of Leto, the royal child of Leto, yeah, that there definitely there's an implication there from the ancient times that Hecate and Artemis have a connection. You know, whether, again, originally they're probably separate deities, but at some point they end up kind of being brought together. In the Ion, Enodia is addressed as daughter of Demeter, who dost rule haunting things which come by night. Okay, so this is where we see Enodia being connected to Persephone, and obviously then we see this connection to ghosts. So yeah, so she has this underworld connection, but she also has this connection to childbirth. And it talks about how, yeah, Hecate has the epithet Phosphoros and is entreated to send blessed visions. In the next line, she is called Enodia. And another source, which is not, they just have initials here, Artemis is Phosphoros Theos. So it says the Thessalian goddess Pharia, worshipped at Pharai, the home of Admetus, is Hecate, Enodia, Brimo, Artemis, the great moon goddess of the Balkans, who has her dwelling in the lower worlds as well. So, okay, we don't need to get into the whole theory here. Now, let me just tell you what this article is, because I said I would. Sun Myths and Resurrection Myths by Grace Harriet McCurdy in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, actually from 1917, so this is quite an old one. It's not a topic people seem to have. There seems to be a lot of recent material on, at least not among the scholarly literature, but that is the discussion there. And honestly, I think any discussion from 1917, there's some aspects of it we need to take with a grain of salt, but I don't think she's wrong about making some of these associations. I do think there is this connection between them. Let's talk for a minute about Enodia and this role that she seems to have. I think one of the curious things, and I may have addressed this in an earlier podcast, I haven't, a lot of times people will ask me questions about podcasts from 6 years ago, and I'm like, I honestly don't remember what I've said in those. So I don't know if this is a repeat of information. In any case, it's an update. But with Artemis, she's another one who's connected to childbirth, but she's also connected to plague and to the killing of children. Her and her brother Apollo both have that connection. And as I mentioned in the Artemis podcast, I know I mentioned this, were the rituals that were often performed to Artemis, like the Artemis Broron rituals, which were meant to appease her, young girls who were about to become marriageable age, and who, by assumption, by marriage, were going to lose their virginity, risked angering Artemis by giving up their virginity. So there's this threshold aspect to Artemis as well. So the idea that she would be connected to both Hecate and to Enodia, and again, the Artemis podcast definitely addresses the connections between Artemis and Hecate, so I'm not going to delve into those here. But there's definitely this idea that they are connected with rites of passage. So if we think about childbirth, okay, if you have a girl who gets married, gets pregnant, and then gives birth to a child, okay, these are all rites of passage. These are all things that change identity. So this is where a girl who might be married and now become a wife, now she becomes a mother. And becoming a mother, whatever your opinion is of becoming a mother, that is a change in identity. Your identity is not the same once you have born a little human being that you need to take care of and that you need to raise, to be a member of the society into which it is born. But also childbirth itself, if you think about children, childbirth is a rite of passage. That's your first rite of passage, actually, coming out of the womb and coming into the world. The idea of labor and labor pains and giving birth is often used as a metaphor for many, many things that are a bit of a trial or a tribulation. And certainly the most literal sense of that is it is certainly a very dangerous process. We don't tend to think of childbirth as being dangerous because of a lot of the medical advances that we feel make it a safer process. But really, childbirth is extraordinarily dangerous, and this is probably why the deities that are connected with protecting children are also the ones that are connected with killing them. Because there's this idea that, because obviously infant death and infant mortality is a thing. And it is something that is always a danger, even today. I mean, if you have children who are raised and are trying to build their immune systems, children are susceptible to getting all kinds of horrible stuff that we don't typically get, or they're just even going out and even interacting with other children, or going to school for the first time, or going to preschool or daycare or whatever. Children can be exposed to all kinds of things, and if these things are not properly guarded against, they can be fatal. So in the absence of vaccinations and other things, certainly we have this idea that you certainly would appeal to certain deities who would have a connection with the underworld, but also have this connection with the earth, with nurturing, with some aspect of childbearing to be your protector. So it seems very likely, with Enodia is placed in this group, that she is some kind of a protector of the home and protector of children. Okay, so we have this idea of being on the threshold, of this idea of initiations, rites of passage. And one thing that's been discussed, I know Murch Eliot has discussed this in his books, about in his book on initiation specifically, is that archaic initiations tended to be around life passages. So yeah, after one is born, there's probably a ritual or a rite for the infant. When somebody enters adolescence, there's a rite of passage into adulthood. When one is married, that's a kind of rite of passage. When one has children of their own, that's a rite of passage. And even the progression towards death may also in itself be a rite of passage. So yeah, these are all initiations that are very natural. They are part of life, and they are part of being alive. Yeah, so we have the idea that you have these guardians of these thresholds, and these different rites of passage that are very important. And now one of the dangers that these deities will protect against are the ghosts or the spirits like Mormo, Gello, and the Lamia. And of course, I have done a podcast on those as well. And it's particularly in the one on the Aorai, Aorai. So if you haven't heard that one, look it up, whether you're on Spreaker or on YouTube. The Aorai are the restless dead. They are the souls of children, or they are the souls of beings who have died before they're supposed to. Children who have not had a chance to grow up, maybe who died in childbirth. And it's interesting because the idea or association is that anyone who dies in this particular state is part of the angry dead. That's why they often become associated with the Furies, and they may become associated with these types of ghostly figures that the festivals that they have that are meant specifically to honor the dead, or also meant to avert their negative effects. Yeah, so to honor and to avert, you have this, you have these things of, it's the same principle as Xenia. I've talked a lot about Xenia, which is the guest friendship principle. Both of them have to do with the aversion of the other with a capital O, whatever that means for you. So in the principle of Xenia, you will have a foreign person who comes to your country, and this can happen for any number of reasons. A lot of these city-states, given their proximity to the sea, they investigated other places, they might have engaged in trade. If they were feeling more bellicose, then they might have been engaging in war and looting a place. These kinds of things were not necessarily uncommon. Thucydides does talk about in his histories about when a particular area had very, very good land, you had to worry about, defending your territory. Sovereignty was a big thing. If you found a nice fertile patch of land, you might be continually trying to fight off invaders who wanted your nice fertile patch of land for their own livestock and their families and so forth. So the idea is that you treat the stranger with a certain kind of respect. You offer gifts. You bring them in. You exchange songs of the bards. The song. You get the songs of their people and their history, and then you hear theirs, and then you have this bond of guest friendship. And the idea, it is you as the host, when you go to their country, you can go to their household, and you can also be welcomed as a guest. Okay, now this is a principle that is really meant to deal with the other in a way that is friendly. It is the same principle that is behind the religious pact. And when I say pact, P-A-C-T, just to make that word clear, it is the same thing behind the pact, because the idea is that you are dealing with a spirit or an energy, whether it be a deity, in this case, whether you're dealing with souls of the dead. It's the idea that you are offering them something to appease them. You are offering them something as an act of friendship, saying, here, I'm giving you this thing, and in return, I ask that you treat me with respect. I'm honoring you, so please don't engage in any kind of behavior that is destructive to me. And I think this is the way anything that was foreign was kind of dealt with. I mean, obviously, invaders notwithstanding, where you would go to war, the idea was that you averted difficulty in your household by engaging in this kind of guest friendship. And if the rules of guest friendship were violated, that was a very, very serious offense. There are many examples in Greek drama, and also even in the Iliad itself, about when guest friendship is violated, what the consequences are of that. And they're very dire, and it's something that even the Greek heroes I'm thinking of the Trojan Women, that particular play by Euripides, when all of the royal family of Troy, the women are all taken as slaves, and then it's discovered that Polymestor has killed the son of Polydorus, who's the son of Hecate, who she had actually sent him away just to keep him away from the war. And then when Polymestor realized that the war wasn't going so well for Troy, he killed her son and took his money, which is a gross violation of Xenia. So, of course, in that play, what she does is her and the other women get together when Polymestor comes to visit the women, and they stab his eyes out. And when the Greek soldiers come and say, hey, what's going on here? And then Hecate says, he murdered my son who was in his house as an act of guest friendship, then the Greek soldiers are like, ooh, well, because of course Polymestor is saying, these terrible women, you need to punish them. And they were just kind of like, yeah, I think you brought this on yourself. They were not going to intervene on behalf of him against the women, because they knew the women were right in punishing him for his violation of guest friendship. That's one example. There are many other ones too. But in any case, it's very important to think about this relationship between that community and the other. Interesting kind of way of looking at it. If I think about our modern situation, the way in which we become very, very tribal in societies, they're supposed to be very open and secular. But that does lead to the next thing I wanted to talk about with regard to Enodia, And that has to do with her epithet that connects her to the city. And in fact, let's see which epithet that is. It is called Enodia Astike, okay, which is the Enodia of the city. Now, to me, this particular epithet is a key to understanding her importance. And what I think, I don't necessarily say this necessarily sets her apart from Hecate, but one thing about Enodia is that she is said to belong more to cities rather than to rural areas. And I think this is incredibly significant. So let me back up and talk about the social structures or the social hierarchies of the Archaic period. Because, and I do talk about this in my book, Death and the Maiden, there's the idea of oikos and there's the idea of polis. Okay, so the oikos is the household. It's the domestic sphere. So when you read a work like the Iliad, for example, you are talking about these heroes who are these generals, these kings, who are tribal kings of certain areas. You know, you have Agamemnon from Mycenae, you have Diomedes from Argos, you have Idomeneus from Crete, you've got Achilles from this area of the Myrmidons, probably Thessaly in this exact area. And et cetera, et cetera. You have all these great generals, and these great generals belong to, they are the tribal kings. So they are not only the head of the household and have this royal lineage, but they also are the protectors of their area too. They're not kings and rulers in the more modern sense that we might think about it. I mean, they are basically the head of the family, and of course they set the rules and the boundaries for the family, but these are also with respect to again, these ideas of what's fair and just and how one deals with forces that are outside the family. Now, one thing Sarah Iles Johnston notes in her book is that in her first chapter, she says it's very curious how Homer, again, the scene in the Odyssey, perhaps notwithstanding, of, Circe or Circe, doing the necromantic rituals on the behalf of Odysseus, Homer seems to really have no knowledge of this kind of method of dealing with ghosts and with spirits. The idea of the one who can bring the dead back in some way, the goit or goite, is the one who can bring the dead back. And these are what we think of as the early necromancers. And what she has suggested is that there's no reason to think that this was not a regular kind of a thing that existed or a service, even though you don't hear it talked about too much. In fact, you don't really hear about it at all too much before the classical period. There seems to be a point, and I seem to remember reading an article where there's the idea that this was almost, or at least there was the Greek implication that this was a practice brought in from Persia. And Persia also brought Zoroastrianism. It also brought probably early forms of Orphism and Pythagoreanism and things like that. Came out of this region that we probably now kind of loosely call Persia. But the idea was that this idea that before that, the idea about the dead was that they were very weak. You had the idea of the psyche and you had the eidolon. And the psyche was the substantial part of your soul, the consciousness, and the eidolon was what remained. That's what went to Hades. That's just, it's like a shadow. It's like a memory of you and who you were. But it's something that's there and has no power except the power that you give it through feeding it and through keeping up the graves and so on and so forth. And these dead didn't seem to have a whole lot of power. The only dead that really seemed to have power were the ones, as I had indicated, who died either a violent death or they died prematurely in some way, and thus became sort of the assistants or the workers with the Furies. So this restless dead, because of the nature of their death, they might not have a proper burial. There might be a lot of reasons why they are roaming around angry and kind of with their lives or something left incomplete or unfulfilled. But this was not something you really heard a whole lot about in the Archaic period. Does not necessarily mean that such rites didn't exist and that things didn't happen, but it definitely becomes more prominent around the 5th century and after, and certainly the Hecatea and also these statues of Enodia become very prominent at this time too. The idea that you have to have this protective deity that represents this space in between, who is a gatekeeper of this liminal space, who can not only protect you, but who you need to appease so they don't turn on you and allow terrible things to come into your house, or allow curses to reach you, or different things. This becomes something far more prominent probably around the 5th century. And the question then would be, why? If the attitude towards the dead is the same, why do the dead suddenly get more power and they get to be bolder? Why is it, the whole idea of the necromancer bringing someone back from the dead, and of course, in order to do that, you have to provide all of the things that will give that dead soul power to do something, whether it be to prophesize, because dead, of course, knew nothing anymore about present, but they could predict the future. You could take these dead, and by the way, if you know anything about necromantic ritual at all, and a lot of people who have done it will say that oftentimes the dead are not super happy about being disturbed. If you disturb them and follow these rituals in this manner, they're a little cranky about it. Okay, and certainly by the time we get to the Roman period, you have the idea of the Lemuria. This is the dead, the Manus and the Lemuria. These are the dead that are not particularly excited. They call them the kindly ones, but it's the same reason that you call the Furies the Erinyes, or the kindly ones. The Eumenides. That's the word for the Furies. They're called the kindly ones. In the same way that you say nice doggy so that it doesn't rip your face off if it's growling at you. So there was this definite increased fear about the boundary between the living and the dead. Now, is this because people were practicing more goetic rituals? I mean, Sarah Iles Johnson does address this idea of Goetia and where this kind of fits into the picture. But it may be that these practices always existed, and we don't really hear about them more until, at least a couple hundred years after Homer. In at least where we're seeing archaeological evidence of this kind of protection from these forces that appearing more frequently in figures like Enodia, where she becomes an important deity. The importance of her to the community, so important that she's among their cult of the 12. But she clearly has a chthonic connection. She's connected to cemeteries. She's connected to an aspect of Zeus that's connected with doorways. And when you think about it, what is the door for on your house? I mean, you open it or you shut it. You don't leave your door unlocked. You lock it if you don't want, strangers to come wandering into your house. I mean, I don't know how often that really happens for people, but this is the reason we have protection on our houses, right? Modern protection is, a ring camera perhaps, and maybe a security system, as well as locks and deadbolts and things like that. This is almost a different way of keeping people out of your house. But it's interesting that this takes place in cities. And that's the piece here that I think is very important and that sets Enodia maybe not entirely apart. You can certainly look at these other deities and say, yes, but they were in cities as well, and and so forth. And I understand that. But we're talking about the oikos. We're talking about this as the structure. And the head of the oikos is often, there's the tribal king. But the role of the female in that household is very, very important, because the woman is the one who is really the center of the oikos, the one who not only who gives birth, but also has to protect the children in her own way, through their nurturing and tending to them and so forth. In addition to whatever the father might do in terms of just protecting the whole family. But the idea that this was protecting the child from things that, not invaders, but rather maybe from illnesses or from these kinds of conditions where children could die young. And that particular role is central in that. And there's this idea of the family and protecting the family line. Now, when we get into the area of the polis, which is what I was starting to talk about before, polis is a word for city. Okay, it has to do with a more metropolitan space. It's where the word politics comes from, right? It's polis, the polis. And when you have a polis, like Athens, for example, would have been a polis. We tend to use the word city-state now, but the idea is that you're talking about a much bigger space with more people than just the local tribes. or the local tribal king. Initially, you may have had something like that, but these cities are more international hubs. They're places where you may have people living, because especially if it's a port city, where you may have people who are living in that city from various countries and cultures. And the bigger these city-states become, especially as we start getting into the building of empires and things like that, the more that whoever the local tribes might have been deal with the other. They are dealing with people with different customs, different cultures. And when you're dealing more with the other, in this sense, there becomes this idea within the context of the city explicitly that one needs some kind of protection. So perhaps, even if it's not literal protection against someone who you think might, say, rob your house or something, which I'm sure is always a thing. Because remember, these statues were also meant to keep burglars out. That was one of their functions. But also, perhaps any spirits or anything that they might, or practices that they might bring with them. If some of these practices of manipulating the dead were considered to come from other cultures and other countries, and this has been postulated, and we don't know that that's true, the suggestion is that if those practices existed, what Sarah Iles Johnson has suggested is that there's a reason to think that Homer didn't talk about them much because they were not something that was particularly common to the culture. It was not something commonly known or commonly engaged with, to the point that it would be addressed. Later on, we see these kinds of practices being addressed in plays and in drama and in the writings of different writers from the Roman period, particularly. You see more of a discussion of these kinds of practices, and you don't see them too much earlier than that. So this could indicate that this is a outside practice that is brought in, this idea of raising the dead. But it could also just be a general fear that people coming in who are foreigners perhaps are bringing gods and practices with them that might be problematic to the people who are already there. Or perhaps, depending on their practices with regard to their dead, do they have ancestral spirits and things that might be coming there? So I guess the point we're trying to make here is that when you move from oikos to polis, when you move from this idea of just the local tribe and the ruling family to this idea of the city-state where you have people from different backgrounds, very diverse places, it's not really different now. I mean, now if I take the United States as an example, if you think about places in the Midwest where there's a lot of farmland, or places in the South, places where there's not a whole lot of people, and perhaps where it's like a local rural community, maybe everybody rallies around one church or one group. It's the social group, but it's also the spiritual life of the community. Whereas if you go to a city, you go to LA, you go to New York, you go to Chicago, Boston, you've got a wider variety of people. You have people from all over. And the likelihood that you are going to run into people who are different from you is pretty common. And if you live in cities, you're pretty much used to that. But when cities become a much newer development in Western civilization, when this idea of having these city-states that were not just populated by people who were all part of that family group or that particular nationality, I guess, for lack of a better word, or I guess it's more of like the tribal group. We tend to talk about them like the Ionians and the Aeolians and then the Athenians, and we tend to talk about them in terms of the group that they belong to. But when you have more of a mixing, when you have people coming in from other places, people who you trade with, and you see this mixing of cultures, that's interestingly when you start to see a rise in these appearances of Enodia statues or the Hecate. It's the idea that we are trying to avert any possible influences that may be coming in that are not familiar to us, and the need to kind of retain that family identity and that family space. As I mentioned, Enodia was a very prominent Thessalian goddess, and it was said that she had a lot to do with Thessaly and its own identity as a city. So, yeah, so you have this idea of these protectors of the city. And I think it's interesting that she's an averter of evil, but she's averting evil for the households within the city, because the city is a mixed bag of influences. And some of them are going to be kind to you, maybe some are not. But nonetheless, it always kind of highlights the idea of the city as being a place that is not always about... the idea of community there is not always what you think it would be. When you have different groups, some groups, again, get to know each other, get along very well. Others may feel that there's, some kind of competition for resources, or there may be difference in cultural practices. We still see that now, where, this group does this practice that offends this group. It's this way of managing the practices of other people, and it's interesting that we see this increased fear of ghosts, or of angry dead, or of restless dead becoming a factor where we see the need for the goetes, where we see the need for these statues that protect the houses, where there's more things to protect the potentially negative influence that comes from the other. And so that is something that I've often considered to be a very interesting development in the rise of the importance of Hecate, and also the rise of the importance of Enodia and deities like even Persephone or Artemis in that particular aspect, or the fact that we see Enodia connected with these particular deities, and with the idea of keeping order, because when you introduce the other, you could be introducing an element of chaos, right? This is something that is not quite the same. And to be at a crossroad, think about it, we can talk about it as the threshold between this world and the other world, but it's also where two roads intersect, where two cultures may intersect. Who's at the other end of each of those roads? This is where things that are different may come together, and things that are, unheimlich, things that are not familiar, things that may be uncanny to us. And some of that may translate into practices with regard to ancestors, with regard to the dead, because certainly a lot of the practices around the dead were certainly ancestral in nature. But we have this ancestral kind of consideration that's going on here in a place where there may be a lot of mixing, where the ancestry may not just be people from your tribal group. You know what I mean? Not everybody in the tribal group, I guess. I would hope they're not all related, but I suppose that happens too. But the idea of, or marriages between different tribes for strategic purposes, this is a little bit more open. This is a little bit more of your melting pot / salad bowl kind of thing. So interestingly, the need to set these boundaries, and the importances of goddesses like Enodia to set boundaries, has to do, I think, with maintaining the identity of the existing culture against those who are considered to be other. So this really represents a shifting idea about the other that I think leaves the door open to more dualistic ways of thinking about what's good and what's evil, rather than simply saying all forces could really go either way. They could be either one. They could go either way. Now we're kind of having this more definite setting of boundaries, and the importance of boundaries, and the importance of proper ritual. We see this in the Bible, too. This is actually absolutely characteristic of the Old Testament. When the Hebrews are getting into difficulties with their neighbors, or when there's an empire that comes in and there's a new king that conquers and says, hey, this is my God, there's this difficulty. And a lot of times what the Hebrews would say was, okay, we've been conquered. Why have we been conquered? How many of the ways of our enemies have we adopted? You read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that's what it's about. Have we adopted the ways of our foreign neighbors, and how many do we have to get rid of? This is not unique to that particular group. There's always the idea of how, you have the oikos within the larger polis. And how does one protect the oikos? What is the boundary between the two? So I almost feel like this increase in concern about the restless dead, about concern about protecting children, and things like that may also come out of this fear of what we think of as the other, where it's not simply I'm the king of this whole castle and of this castle's an overblown word, but I'm the king of this domain, and you have come to visit my domain, and I'm welcoming you as a guest. This is a bit different from that. This is a whole different social hierarchy and social construct. So this feels like something that is connected to that need to set boundaries. Because as Sarah Iles Johnson also pointed out, herms, which are these rather interesting figures with a head and a phallus on them usually, that are used to mark property. If we think about in America, the idea that Native Americans, even though they were different tribes, there wasn't this idea that anybody owned land, per se. I mean, people might fight over resources just like other tribes, but it wasn't until the Europeans came over and had the idea of, oh, no, this is my property. This is almost the beginning of ideas of property and boundaries and protecting what's mine. So in a way, it's almost like we think of xenophobia as being tribal, but it seems to be almost the way in which I am protecting my family and my identity against the identities of other groups. So I don't know. Something worth thinking about there. But I think this is what makes Enodia a deity. She's very similar to Hecate in her role. She definitely has this underworld connection. She has a lot of the same attributes of Artemis and Hecate. And again, that's another aspect of being in a city environment, is that the local gods and the local pantheons or dodekatheons will change depending maybe on who's in charge or what's been merged together. So which is why you can have a deity mean one thing or archaeological dig that represents something at one period of time and it represents something later on, because these things eventually end up kind of merging together in some fashion. That may well be the case with a lot of these deities, but I think Enodia in particular seems to have this particular connection to cities. Now, of course, somebody will probably come on and say, well, Hecate has that too. Well, perhaps. But one of the things that's been said about Enodia is that she seems specifically to be connected to cities. And that's what makes me think of this particular aspect, that the appearance of Enodia as an important deity comes out of this need to retain identity. The need to retain the noble families of Achilles or of Jason, right? The nobility of that. They're all connected to that area and towards the protection of that when new groups start living in that particular area or coming in. So anyway, just some thoughts on that. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this interesting. If you do enjoy this podcast and you are not currently subscribed to my Patreon, please consider subscribing, as I do try to do at least one extra podcast a month, sometimes two, for people who are at the Hecate, speaking of the Hecate tier and above. That's the $5 tier. And I also will give regular updates, and also early access to the podcast is another benefit, plus courses where they are available. Right now, I have the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth. I actually canceled the spring 2025 term, and there's more information about that on the website. Just for now, I have a lot of other things going on right now that make a lot. I'm probably trying to do too much at once here. So in any case, there'll be more updates on all of that. But I do all my updating on Patreon. So do consider subscribing if you are interested. Even free subscribers will get certain updates now and again. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram still as @Chthonia Podcast, one word. And similarly on YouTube, if you are not watching this on YouTube, I am at youtube.com/@Chthonia Podcast, one word. And I do live streams on Wednesdays usually, and some Wednesdays again. My schedule could be very up in the air starting this summer for at least a short period of time. So definitely check my website, chthonia.net. I just migrated and updated that. If you want to also keep up with updates with me there as well. So yeah, I think that's everything for now. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.